Right. So this is the monthly uh, specification and education call. This is the North America Europe variant, which basically is reasonably good for those in the US in the morning, reasonably good for those in Europe in the afternoon, and utterly horrific for our Asian demographic. For those of you in Asia who might be watching the recording, don't worry, you're not left out. Later in the month, we also have a call designed to support Asia. So this call, as with all of the calls we do in Linux Foundation, is under the antitrust policy notice. Full antitrust policy can be found on the website. And if you're from a member company of the Linux Foundation, you can ask questions of our council and be up to go. Now, I apologize in advance if there's some background noise. I'm in Paris outside. So I'll try to keep myself clear, and to increase bandwidth, I'll turn off my video. I will just outline that this call, this monthly call for North America and Europe, has a clear structured agenda. We like to make sure that everything is reviewed in a sequence. So because this call focuses on specification matters and education matters, it focuses on what the specification work group is doing and what the education work group is doing. It also has a space for other items that might be relevant to the core of OpenChain's work. You could raise any other business, anything at all related to OpenChain, and either our standards, our reference material, our training, our local communities, and so on. And then we close the meeting. Now, today we have two slides on specification. One is an overview slide in general about what we're discussing today, and another is a bit of a deep dive into what the steering committee talked about recently. Let's have a look at the general thing. Now, Chris, the chair of specification, is on the call. So, Chris, is it okay if I give a brief overview of this, and then maybe we do a bit of back and forth? Chris is muted, so I'm going to assume yes, thumbs up. Right. There's three things going on around our spec. One, which is on the next slide, is a briefing on what the steering committee said. Basically, we develop things openly across these calls and our mailing lists and on GitHub. And then all of the open community activity is summarized, structured, and taken to a steering committee made up of our board members. And then they do final reviews and votes. For example, if someone proposes a new specification or someone proposes an update to an existing specification. The steering committee met recently just beside a board meeting, and they did a little bit of review of stuff. We'll go into it in the next slide. The most pertinent points for us as a community is that for 2 years, we worked on proposed updates to our existing ISO standards, ISO 5230 for open source license compliance, ISO 18974 for open source security assurance. These proposed updates went into the processes we use for proposed updates, going through an editing cycle led by Chris, then going into a public comment period, which went on for 6 months and terminated on December 19th last year. And now we're in the middle and the latter part of a 3-month freeze period, which is essentially a last chance for people to look at draft proposed updates to the ISO standards. The question people might have is what happens after the freeze period? Because of course it's ending soon. The answer is that after the freeze period, the community draft proposed updates go to the steering committee for a formal vote on whether they accept the updates or not, or if they accept them at what time scale, et cetera, et cetera. So we're very close to the point in March where we're formally kicking the community work to the steering committee for a formal vote on their part. In other words, watch this space. Next month will be where we wrap up our community work, and it's the steering committee's responsibility to start making decisions. Now, separate to all of that, we have an ISO standard in the market for 5 years. That's ISO 5230, license compliance. When you have the type of ISO standard we have, which came through something called a pass process, every 5 years, ISO checks, is it still relevant? Is it used? Should we keep it active? Separate to anything we do around updating the standards, this 5 year periodic review is a must and will occur. That happens in October of this year. The question is, what happens there? The answer, and you'll see more details regarding that on the steering committee meeting slide, is we basically send a letter to ISO saying, yes, the standard is still useful. Yes, it is being used. Yes, we do want to keep it. Thank you very much. So in short, that's where we are. And Chris, to bring you in, if that's all right, this type of thing of going through proposed updates for the standards, having the public comment period, having the freeze period, this type of thing of having the periodic review at ISO. You've done standards for a long time, and I understand that one way to frame what we're doing at the moment is business as usual. Checking if standards needs updating, checking about periodic reviews. And while it might seem a little boring to people thinking, why aren't they actually just doing something right now? What we are doing is the structured, reliable processes that ISO uses to make sure that everything is super predictable. Do you think that's a fair summary?
Absolutely. I have been a little amazed at how structured and rigorous their process is and rigid on this whole thing. And they've actually got the Gantt charts and bar charts and with circles and arrows and stars on them showing where everything is supposed to happen and then where it really is. So yes, I would say that's exactly what we're doing.
And I suppose one thing that comes up perhaps is that people may request information along the lines of transparency and so on. And our stance has always been everything we're going to do, we talk about it on these calls. And I think that's about as transparent as we can get. And the only thing is to encourage people, any questions, any concerns, raise them here and we'll address them as soon as possible. And Chris, you've been fantastic on doing that, as people ask questions and um, relying on you to continue helping as and when needed.
Yeah, I've been a little surprised, and I actually kind of like that transparency because the ISO IEC specification process is pretty locked down, and you're really not supposed to be sharing uh, copies of the draft things unless you've got a technical expert within your organization that wants to provide some comments to it. But those are all submitted back on the actual members of the working groups. Uh, ANSI is not quite so rigorous, but again, there's no transparency to outside organizations, although you can invite outsiders to sit in and listen to the meetings, but you have to announce them and say where they're from and kind of why they're needing access, and then the board chair, I guess, approves them or not. So I would say that our process within the OpenChain project is the most open of them all and transparent. And I think it's a good thing, especially since open source software is also very transparent.
One thing that I think has been great, and Chris, I mean, people like yourself who come from many years in standardization have been so welcoming of the open approach we've taken. And I must give credit, JTC1, just fantastic. When we went to SC27 IT security to talk about the security standard. Everyone has been so welcoming, which is great because their traditional processes were quite different. And here we are creating open standards in an open source way. Now, we are very strict in that we have our processes. We have these public periods, freeze periods, we have the steering committee votes. But yeah, we do have all the doors open. Everyone is literally welcome on the call. So it's been great how traditional standards orgs have been so welcoming, standards people have been so welcoming, and very fortunately we have people like you, Chris, who know both worlds and have been the bridge.
Yeah, well,
Right.
that's because that's because I'm a member of SC27, so I told them they better behave themselves. No, I'm just kidding. But I actually am a
This,
member of the JTC1 uh, that covers SC27 and the AI and SC42.
which may be super useful. AI will come up later in this call.
Okay.
Right. Steering committee, in case people are wondering, what's the secret sauce that happens when the board members as the steering committee meet and make all the decisions in secret? Well, the answer is they don't. we, they meet and they talk about stuff and they write it down. If it's a meeting with face-to-face conversation, we record it and we publish it online. The last meeting was a virtual meeting. It was adjacent to our board meeting, but we sort of ran out of time. So we moved the steering committee meeting to email, and here's what happened. It was a review of status. So essentially, they had a formal review that the freeze period is underway and that it ends on the 20th of March. This meant that the steering committee formally acknowledged the end of the freeze period and therefore is formally ready on the 20th of March to receive our draft proposals from the perspective of thinking, this is what the community said they'd like to see in updates. What does the steering committee decide regarding this proposal? And regarding the periodic review of ISO 5230, they just reviewed formally our feedback from what's called our past submitter. So going to JTC1 to get an ISO standard created through the PASS process, we have an intermediate organization, a PASS submitter called the Joint Development Foundation. It's another part of Linux Foundation. And formally speaking, steering committee asked Joint Development Foundation, what is it we need to do? Joint Development Foundation went to JTC1 and got some feedback and came back to us. So steering committee again had a look at that, reiterated that that was the stance, and understand 3 points. That we will be providing a letter to JTC1 confirming that ISO 5230 is stable, that the version in hand is unchanged, the specification is supported by us, and there's no changes to the underlying terms. For instance, we haven't changed copyright, processes, IPR. Now, bear in mind that our proposed updates to our ISO standards and the periodic review are completely separate. So regardless of what happens with A, including, if the steering committee says we hate the idea of making any updates, we're going to say no to the community. Or if they do the opposite and say we love the updates, we're going to do that. That's a completely separate and independent topic from the periodic review with ISO. So they are looking at those as separate matters. They will be taking separate decisions, and they were just being very clear about the actions they expect to undertake in October for the periodic review, 1911. There are no actions taken during the steering committee meeting. They took no votes. They just reviewed the situation and prepared for voting later. They expect that at the Q2 meeting, they will formally vote on the proposed updates to ISO 5230 and ISO 18974. That meeting will be happening at the same time as Open Source Summit North America in June. And that meeting will be face to face. So all of you on the call or watching the recording are very welcome to come along as observers and see what happens. We'll be communicating that more broadly shortly. Right. That is basically it on the spec side. Now, Chris and I had a conversation one-to-one, and we were talking about an important question, which is, and I'm just jumping ahead, will OpenChain make new specifications and standards? We're going to talk about that at the end of the call in the sort of other business items. But before that, let's hand over to education because they've been doing some interesting stuff. Chair of Education, Andrew Katz, on the call. And I put down three things. The capability model, reaching general release. I'll just fix that there. The explainers, reaching a general release, and then next steps. Is that okay as a starting point for you, Andrew?
Sounds fantastic. Yes, thank you very much, Shane. Much appreciated. So brilliant. Well, if you're happy for me to take over from here, first of all, my extreme apologies because having just come back from FOSDEM, like several of you probably have already, FOSDEM is probably one of the world's greatest forums for information exchange involving open source. Unfortunately, the probably most information-dense piece of information that was exchanged was the DNA sequence of the influenza virus. So I managed to acquire that and processed it rather too much. So I've only just sort of emerged from my sickbed, which hopefully will also go some way towards explaining. I have to sort of do extreme apologies to Sasha and David as well from Deloitte, because I was hoping to catch up with you after FOSDEM, but prior to this call, and I haven't been able to do that because if you don't know, Sasha and David have been sort of very sort of heavily involved in the capability model that we have been working on. And also, again, thanks to people like Martin Yaghi's been sort of very heavily involved as well. So we've had some sort of fantastic feedback there. Anyway, so one of the things that the 2 days of intense open source activity on the Saturday and the Sunday, but it sort of spread out to several days before and several days afterwards as well. There's a lot of sort of peripheral events that are going on there. One of them was ChaosCon. So for those of you who aren't familiar with ChaosCon, Chaos is another Linux Foundation project, and they are doing excellent work in terms of really generating metrics around all aspects of open source community engagement, community health, project health, so on and so forth. Now, I'm not going to go into details of what the capability model that we've been working on is, because I've sort of mentioned that in the past. But essentially, and it's based on OpenChain standard ISO 5230, so we're talking about license compliance here, is to enable organizations to really benchmark their capabilities across each of the requirements within OpenChain 5230. And so that then leads on to the idea that it provides a framework to generate statistics. Now, what I'm working on in the background with my sort of consultancy Orcro hat on is we're working on essentially a web app that will enable people in a very simple way to establish what their own level of capabilities are by answering a number of questions based on the capability model. And it's not a million miles away from the OpenChain self-assessment tool, but it's more fine-grained than that. But of course, one of the great advantages of doing this is that you're able to gather information. So we're going to ask people who are using this web app to determine their own capabilities as far as OpenChain is concerned, whether they're prepared to share their information on a fully anonymized basis. And that's going to provide us with some really sort of interesting statistical information. And the people at the Chaos project are very interested in using this information to combine with the other data sets that they've had in order to generate some interesting sort of statistical backgrounds in terms of sort of health of projects, health of communities, and so on and so forth. So there's a number of conversations that we have to have there. But I mean, this is based on a presentation that Stephen Pollard and I did at ChaosCon that went down very well. So Shane, thank you very much indeed for providing the launch of the capability model. We are still developing it. It's in basically a sort of a state of continuous improvement, and we are going to be presenting the next iteration of it at FOSS Backstage in Berlin, which I think is in March as well. So we're going to have our friends from Deloitte, Sasha and David, is going to be involved in that process. This is it's a really exciting project. I think I'm very pleased with the way that it's gone. Absolutely delighted by the level of engagement that we've had from people involved in the education work group, and I think it's sort of a great example of how the OpenChain community can come together and help develop that. So that's the story on the capability model. We've published where it's available. Any feedback, please feel free to come back to me, come raise any issues on the OpenChain, GitHub, etc., etc. There's a number of ways that you can get back with that. But I think we are developing that into a really, really useful tool, and we can see that becoming a very useful part of the wider open source ecosystem. So that is that. Likewise, the explainers that we've been working on as well, and again, thanks very much to people like Martin who put a lot of effort into those. We were talking about those quite a lot during FOSDEM. People like the idea. So for those of you that aren't aware, these are very simple documents, just essentially a few pages that can be easily repurposed into slides, and they're intended to make it easy to explain to people from different departments within an organization how the OpenChain specification, again 5230, we're talking about license compliance here, can benefit their organization, and obviously the way that you will explain it to them is going to be different depending on, for example, whether they're in the C-suite or whether they're involved in training activities, whether they're senior developers, whether they're into sales and marketing or whatever. So my fundamental belief is that OpenChain is a benefit throughout an entire organization, but the benefits that individual departments will see are going to be slightly different depending on what the focus of that department is. And the explainers are designed to act as a starting point for anyone that wants to try to explain how OpenChain works within an organization, and then can target the particular message to within those particular departments within the organization. So again, great feedback at FOSDEM, and we've had a lot of interest in, for example, translating the explainers into other languages and so on. So another great example of how the OpenChain community can come together and develop that stuff. So in terms of the education work group, it's proven to be a fantastic resource, a fantastic opportunity for people to come together and do stuff as well. I think I'm very pleased with the way that those two projects have been so successful. I guess where we go to next, I'm sort of throwing that out to the community. I mean, Shane, I don't know if you've got any sort of particular sort of input on that.
I have an initial thought, which is to cast our eye perhaps on the online training thing again.
Yes.
One thing that I've noticed is that LF Training, first of all, they support our free online courses, but they've also started to roll out certification for individuals. So it's not about ISO certification for orgs, but certification for individuals is being prepared around OSPOs for To-Do Group. There's a new thing coming out for them. So maybe we could look at extending our existing free courses and refreshing them. to have them provide some form of certification. And that could be something we could do with LF training, perhaps. Just an idea, spitballing. We
Yeah.
have introduction to open source license compliance management, and then there's another one a little more advanced of how to do open source license compliance management. So those are two courses done and dusted by Balakrishna and the team a few years ago.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense to me. Okay, so my proposal there is that this is something that we can pick up in slightly sort of greater depth in the next session, and we can get a sort of feeling for what the appetite is for doing that. But certainly, from my perspective, that sounds like a sort of eminently sensible approach and entirely consistent with the way that we've been proceeding previously.
I'm very happy to prepare some material to show the background of the courses, so people can get the hang of this material, can understand perhaps what's currently existing and why. And I'm not going to go into a deep dive, but just by way of example, we do house the material online in our GitHub as usual. It's in the reference material repo. And the online course, both courses are here. The course content is available, and we can, essentially go through and see what they have, and then iterate it and hand it back to LF training. So LF training takes this course content and then loads it into their training system. And we have a copy of it so people can take it and put it into their internals. But yeah, we should be able to work from the docx, which they used. And on the next call, I'm very happy to help share the docx and some of the explanations of how we created it, how they ingested it, and why it both is structured the way it is and might occasionally look a bit janky, a bit messy. But that's because it's a source doc that they copy paste into an online system. Yeah, so I'm happy to take that as an action item if it's useful.
That's fantastic. Yes, please. Thank you. Excellent. Well, I think that covers it from me. So thank you, Shane.
Brilliant. Andrew, thank you so much. Does anyone have any questions about this stuff we're doing with capability models and explainers and now potentially updated training? Yes, Martin, you.
If my video works, just about.
Yes.
The only thought that I had for possible future education-related work was potentially around things like the tooling kind of area, but it's not something that I know particularly very much about. So I don't know what the tooling work group has done either, but I'm beginning to get a little bit more interested in that area and just wondering what we have at a very high level, if you like, just so that people understand the landscape of the tooling, rather than any details of the specific tools, etc. But I'm just throwing that out there as a possibility for the future.
It's a very good point. And I'm sharing the screen and sharing a link to something that's in a folder marked old in the repo. And old should be taken to mean completely outdated. For God's sake, don't use this. So the last time we did something formally in landscape and whatnot was quite a while back. The tooling work group is going to have a massive meeting, it seems, in early April, just before the legal and licensing workshop in Essen, Germany. Tooling work group is going to have their meeting between the 7th and 9th of April in Stuttgart, Germany, with various automotive companies and local government and SMEs gathering. It'll be formally announced, I think, in the next couple of days. They just got the location locked down. They're just preparing the event for it. Long story short, yes, the tooling work group should be in a position to give us an updated capabilities map of what's out there in the market and so on and so forth. I guess what we could do, education work group, is tell them what we want quite specifically so they fill out that thing. So in other words, rather than an open-ended question of can you show us the industry's capabilities, to ask specifically, can you can you fill out this? Chris, over to you.
Oh, I just had a question. Is that European kickoff group in April, is that going to be a virtual component as well?
So their main thing currently planned is face-to-face, but what I do intend to do is, apart from the local stuff, which is, local introductions, companies, blah, 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 I do intend to try to make sure there is dial-in available to people so they can at the very least listen in. And I do intend to try and record it and share that as well. What I expect is that they'll be getting together workshop style and spend quite a lot of time with back and forth. And then really what we'll be looking for is the outcomes to be summarized on online calls and briefings afterwards. But yeah, I will try and provide access to the meeting, and we will definitely have few briefings afterwards as well.
Great, thank you.
I think I will try to attend the Stuttgart meeting if I can, but it'll obviously depend on the details being confirmed and getting travel approved. But hopefully I'll go.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, we had hoped to have announced this a lot earlier. The thing that was borderline was, could we get a venue? So Bosch, Marcel from Bosch is taking the lead on setting this up. And we'll have nice friends from places like Mercedes and the local government. But the question was, where could we have it? And there were some hiccups in securing a venue. So we're way behind time on announcement. But the last I saw on the email thread, venues are secured and they're in the final part of getting the dual language event form launched. So should be very soon. Stuttgart, by the way, is very easy to get to. So, for those in Europe, it should be easy to pop in. I think day 1 and 2 will be the main days. Day 3 will be kind of a blue sky workshopy moment. Anyway, updates to follow on that. Right. We have 2 more items. One is timing of this call. As it happens, I'm in Europe right now, so this call is very suitable for me, but normally I'm not. And the question is of who would chair the ongoing North America-Europe call has been a bit of a challenge to fill. Last month, I proposed that we adjust our calls to having one North America-Asia and one Europe-Asia call per month, and each call reports on the other, so no one misses anything. This would make administration a lot easier because it would mean that as the chair of the calls, I wouldn't have to turn up at 2 a.m. Japan time. So given that that proposal was put out last month and raised on the list, and there have been no objections, my suggestion, if there are no objections on this call, is that starting in March, we will adjust to a North America-Asia on the second Wednesday and a Europe-Asia on the third Wednesday of each month going forward. I wanted to check if people have any concerns or objections to this. All right, if nothing is raised, we'll give it a try. If it doesn't work out, we'll adjust. Now, the any other business is something Chris and I had a bit of a talk about the other day, which is the question which is brewing around our community about, will OpenChain make more standards? Will it make new specifications and standards? And I wanted to explicitly answer that question based on what we see happening across OpenChain project and what just happened at the board meeting during the very beginning of February. Right now, OpenChain is in a position where it could potentially make new standards and specifications in the future. There is work underway to build guides for SBOM quality and AI bill of material compliance. SBOM quality is currently confined to the telco industry with the telco work group, but our SBOM study group is highly likely to begin working on a cross-industry SBOM quality guide in the next quarter. Meanwhile, The AI study group is already working on a question around AI bill of material compliance management processes. They're making that guide right now. So that means essentially this year that we know of, we have two clear guides. One is in final editing, the other is highly likely to begin active editing. And therefore, we have two items that will be put out for community reaction and steering committee discussions. I'm fixing that. The steering committee and community reaction discussions could go down an avenue we've seen before. When we started in security, we basically forked the license compliance spec, made a guide saying, here are the bits that are relevant for security. When people liked that, we took that guide and then we turned it into a specification. That became an industry standard and that became an ISO standard. In other words, we have a precedent for creating a guide to a process management challenge. If the guide is well received, turning that into a specification. If that is well received, that can become an industry standard, and from there it can become an ISO standard. This does not mean that every guide we produce will become a standard, but it does mean that there is a path, if the market likes stuff, for us to do that. So, in short, will we make new specifications or standards? Maybe. There is work to build new guides for SBOM quality and AI bill of material. SBOM quality is focused on telco. They're on version 1.0. 1.1 is coming out shortly. It's already adopted by companies like Nokia. The cross-industry version is highly likely to begin this quarter, and therefore we're highly likely to see a cross-industry SBOM quality guide around Q2. AI bill of material compliance guide is actually nearly done. So that'll probably be released either later this quarter or sometime next quarter. Those two guides, if people love them and are very happy with them, could be proposed to the steering committee as potential specifications. If you love them, feel free to do so. That's how the community works. So yeah, that's it. In short, if people want to know about could we make new standards or specifications? Yes. Are we doing it? Not yet. Do we have stuff that could be there? Yes. Watch the space for SBOM quality process management and AI bill of material compliance process management. I guess I'll pause there and just say this kind of goes back to what Chris and I chatted about earlier with the complete transparency. I mean, you're getting inside the sausage factory with this. Chris, I don't know if you have any comments you want to make on this kind of outline of the potential.
Yeah, I think that there's a real potential there, and we ought to aggressively take a good hard look at it. I think the one caution that I would have from my time with the other specification group is to make sure that we're not diverging between an industry approach to SBOM quality specification and an AI bill of materials specification, because AI is nothing but software. So they need to be intertwined like cojoined twins. And if there is something that turns out, and I haven't seen it yet, that is so spectacularly different that requires a different specification for AI and the bill of materials that comes out of it, then so be it. But I think we need to keep that thought in mind, that if one specification is the right approach, because it's all software, the components that build software are software. They all contain copyrights. They all contain provenance data, metadata, everything else. So we need to be thinking about that as we're starting to evaluate specification.
It's such an excellent point, and it touches on something which you and I chatted about, and we've talked about on these calls before. The board has talked about it. 2 points. One, we're definitely not in the business of making standards for fun or to look cool. So
Mm-hmm.
we're in the business of solving problems. And if we make a standard, it will be because we are filling a market gap, not because we feel compelled to expand our portfolio. That's one point. Another point is that we're high level. This is something that Chris just hit, which is if one thing will cover, don't do two. And also, there's the question of, lots of ideas come to the table. If something comes to the table, we have to consider, is it high level, what we do, or is it more granular? Is it something that can be incorporated into what we do, or is it something on an implementation level we don't touch? And I'll give a clear example. Chris and I were just chatting the other day about security attestation. And Chris pointed out that for many companies, when it comes to, let's say, open source, security attestation is something they include in their bill of materials. So for companies, maybe the optic, if they're thinking, how do I do security attestation? I'm thinking about that in CRA. Their answer might be, yeah, it's a bill of materials challenge. I'll do it there. So, that's one example of where you might sit back and think, oh, here's a challenge. Oh, is it fixed by a high level approach? If so, can it fold under there, et cetera, et cetera. So long story short, as Chris just cautioned, every time we have a great idea or a great guide or a great proposal, we need to look very carefully at whether it's additive to our mission or something that would distract, diverge, or make more complex everything for everyone else. And Chris, you put it very well, I think, with the idea of, trying to find out the commonalities. Is software software? Is there anything unique about software X? If not, perhaps we can bundle the solution. So there's one approach as opposed to two, etc.
Yeah, and I think
Right.
that the conversation about attestations is an attestation can be a part of the SBOM, which is a convenient way of providing it, but it all starts out with the same source. You're looking for the vulnerabilities and threats that exist in the software when you first start using the software through scanners. And I know some of you are very familiar with software scanning. And you identify the vulnerabilities and then you mitigate them as as you need to in order for the software that you're delivering. But you then need to pass that information on to the customer so the customers are aware of what still is in their software and why you, the vendor or developer, didn't feel that it needed to be mitigated for the particular application that it's embedded in. So to address attestation separately is kind of a limited thought process about what you're actually doing and where they come from. And I'm
And
always
I
willing.
think,
Go ahead.
sorry, go ahead. No,
No,
you.
I was just going to say I'm always willing to be re-educated or change my opinion of that, but that's what I've seen to date with what we are doing with vulnerability scanning, SBOMs, and vulnerability detection and mitigation, and then creating attestations, which either can remain in the SBOM or if the customer prefers it delivered separately.
Jeff, I see your hand is up. Over to you.
Sure, I think it's a very interesting conversation. I appreciate Chris's thoughts on this. I I think on the AI side, it does seem like there's still a lot of debate about what is appropriate and what is expected and what is possible and what is legal in terms of disclosures and kind of the equivalent of the bomb. On the software side, we've had 20 or 30 years to say uh, what we think is appropriate for in a bomb, in the bomb, in the S bomb, et cetera. And I think on the AI side, people saying, well, we can't disclose, let's say there's health records in the model. We're not going to say who the people were and what their diseases were because that's PII and so on and so on. So I think there may be still some philosophical debates about what is an AI bomb and what needs to be disclosed and to what level we get there, which may be distracting from kind of classic S bombs in the sense of physical components. It's source code, it's binaries, it's images, it's icons, it's websites. Um, the existence of a particular model may be something that's not controversial to say, oh, we're using model A or model B. But then as we get into the training data, that's where we seem to have all the various arguments and philosophical disagreements about what is appropriate to disclose or not. So I guess I would round that out as I think it's maybe a little too early to say there's a one-stop shop for classic software bomb, SBOM, and AI SBOM. So I would say probably we should expect to keep them somewhat separate for a little while until we kind of hash out especially the privacy and PII aspect of the training data.
It's a really good point, and that's exactly why we're having this discussion. And I think that's something for people who are watching the recording to really take away, that the whole point of what we do is we discuss this to find out what it is we must do. And that means that every time you have an idea, including don't do this or do this, please bring it to the table because we're teasing out the frontier here. And like Jeff said, one interesting thing about AI is we have software, and the software bits are software. So we're fairly familiar with that. But then again, there's huge corpuses of data, and some of that data is distilled and transformed. Some of it is actively transformed by the AI as it processes things. And then there's documentation like model cards. So we're not in a clarity position regarding AI yet. And that's, I think, what the AI study group or AI work group nowadays is working on and talking through. So I highly recommend joining the AI work group and looking at the guide they're making, both with the eye of saying, well, gosh, it's sort of like a fork of our existing ISO 5230 process management for license compliance. The AI one looks suspiciously similar. And then asking, so what's different, and isolating those bits and saying, I see. So yeah, no, it's very much a discussion to have. How much is similar, how much is not? And particularly transformation of data, access to data is a peculiar one with AI. And it seems like in general, the market is nowhere near having the dust settled on it. So yeah, fun times. That's why we're here. And we should always ask two questions: what's new, and is it new enough to be completely separate? And that's where I think it was very useful there to have Chris talking about how SBOM quality is an overarching topic, and AI bill of material compliance management may have large overlaps, and equally so, Jeff pointing out that things like personally identifiable information, AI transformations, and access, that can be quite a peculiar thing. So when you're getting something in the supply chain from your supplier and they say AI, you might want to ask additional questions to find out precisely what's going on there with that AI and what the implications would be, especially with the regulatory environment. So it's an interesting discussion. Dust hasn't settled. That's why we're building guides, as opposed to saying we're done. So please join the SBOM study group and the AI work group to deep dive on that. But I will be asking both of them to come to these calls to talk to the spec team so that we're getting a long heads up on where their guides are at, not because we will immediately assume that we're turning them into specs, but so that we're ready. If that conversation starts, we know exactly what they've done, why, how, and we're in a position to say, we agree, we disagree, we're ready to talk, we're not. Chris, I guess we'll rely on you to have the cautious, jaundiced eye on this one to help make sure we
Yeah,
steer the most careful oil tanker.
my jaundiced eye is slightly clouded by many years of experience of trying to get down to the bedrock of the various AI programs, whether they're convoluted neural networks or just exactly what kind of a mechanism is the background for creating the AI, and coming to how do we legally determine, and Heather, if she was here, she could jump right into this conversation. How do we know that they've got the approval of the organization that's delivering this software for all the content? Because
Yep.
in the industrial world, when we're developing software for, say, a locomotive or a Caterpillar truck or a giant 22-axis milling machine, when we disclose the software on that, there's a lot of intellectual property and trade secrets contained in that software, which are akin to PII. It's something you cannot let out the door. And so it's not part of how we release the information. So I think that that's one of the things that we just need to talk about is when we're thinking about specification level, is how granular do we want to allow people to be, and how deep does our specification say that it's a quality SBOM as long as it reports these things, but these things are verboten. So it's just a
And
categorization.
yeah, no, absolutely. And, this is going to be an exciting year because we're going to have all types of discussions around this. And, quite frankly, we're going to rely on a lot of different perspectives to come to the table. I'm going to bring Heather back, by the way, on this topic, Chris. I'm
I
going to
like
bring
Heather.
Heather's great. Heather Meeker, for those who don't know, she's just fantastic. And Jeff, one thing I'd love is you're on the real cutting edge here. You're part of the GitHub team. Um, you're in the forefront of a lot of these data points. So I'd love if, as this conversation unfolds, you can also help steer us and guide us.
Sure, my pleasure. Looking forward to it.
Yeah, me too.
Well, it'll be fun. This is where everyone who is thinking, oh my goodness, all they're talking about on specification is like paperwork. They've got draft updates and freeze periods. They're doing periodic reviews. There's nothing happening.
Yeah,
No,
no.
there's a lot happening. We're about to kick off some hot topics. There will be tomatoes flying across the room. It's going to be very exciting. Right. Speaking of exciting, there's a space. As we get ready to close the meeting, I just wanted to open up and ask, does anyone have any other business? Okay. If not, then we're going to close the meeting here. You get 5 minutes back in your day. And I just want to say thank you to everyone for a valuable conversation. This recording will be shared wide and far. Be
Thank you
well.
very much.
Take care.
Thanks,
All
everyone.
right.
Bye-bye
Have a
now.
great day.
Have a great one.
Take
Bye-bye.
care.
Thanks.
Hey,
Bye-bye.
y'all,
Bye-bye.
y'all stay away from them flu bugs.